Hey everybody, Mike Iaconelli back out here in the shop, and we have a brand new video for you today. And in today's shop, we're talking about a lure, a soft plastic that has really been forgotten about. This is a lure solid type that used to be a big deal a long time ago, but now it's sort of faded out of the spotlight. And in today's shop, we're talking about the good old school lure called a grub. Grub. G-R-U-B. Now, if you're watching this video and you're older, if you're, let's say, 40 years old or older, you know exactly what a good old curl-tail grub is. But for a lot of our younger viewers, you might not even know what that is. So we're going to talk all about the grub, why use a grub, how to rig it, how to fish it. We're going to go over the whole thing. All right, let's start by talking about what is a grub. And, you know, generically, a grub is a 2 to 5 inch soft plastic lure that has a curl or a sickle tail on the back. Man, I remember fishing these lures as a kid. They were by Mr. Twister, by Man's, old curl tail grubs. But now, these grubs are sort of grown up, a little bit more modernized, but they have the same great features that make these baits a better choice in a lot of scenarios, okay? So it's a grub. You know, I'm going to fish this lure under a lot of different conditions. I fish them in the spring, I fish them in the summer, I fish them in the fall, and they're even a great choice when the water's cold in the winter. It's a lure that's compact. It's a lure that imitates a lot of different forage, a minnow, a bluegill, a little perch. Even as we creep it slower along the bottom, it could imitate a crawfish, an actual earthworm, an insect. There's a lot of things this thing can imitate. But that action of that curl tail, that rhythmic flow of that tail is really what makes this bait special. All right, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the grub, I want to start this video by explaining why I would pick a grub. Here's a 5-inch grub. Why I would pick a grub over a finesse swim bait or a swim bait style lure. And that's really the lure that took this out of the equation. You know, when these things came out, finesse swim baits is a 2.8 Berkley power swimmer, a 3.3 Berkley power swimmer. There's another generic 4-inch little boot tail swim bait. When these things came out, guys forgot about that grub. But there's a couple scenarios where that grub is a better choice, okay? So let me sort of put them side by side and we'll give them to you, okay? 100% if that water is ultra clear and if those fish are tight-lipped, if those fish are tough, if it's a cold front scenario, if those fish are getting a lot of pressure, there's 30 dudes in front of you, that little finesse swim bait is a better choice, right? That's a great choice. Cold water, tough fish, clear water, high pressure, lots of fishing pressure. That little finesse swim bait's a good one. But what if it's the opposite? What if the water is stained? What if the water is dirty to outright muddy? Better. What if it's prefrontal? What if it's a day that's cloudy and windy and the fish are active, the fish are chasing and biting? Better choice, right? And even on cold water that's warming, better choice than that. So it has a place in your soft plastic fishing, right? It has a place in your soft plastics fishing, the Grub. All right, let's get into size and color, because I want to hit that real quick before we get into how to rig this thing. If you look at my little stash right here, this is honestly, this came directly from my bags and boxes of Grubs. And I carry everything from these ultra finesse, this is a 2-inch and 3-inch Berkley Power Grub, Berkley Power Bait Power Grub, 2 and 3-inch, all the way up to the more standard 3 and 4-inch. And honestly, these two sizes are going to get the bulk of my use, 3 and 4-inch. And about the biggest one I'm going to carry is that big 5-inch Grub. The main thing on size, and I'm getting to sound like a broken record, is really try to pick the size Grub that mimics the 4-inch in the water. It mimics what they're eating, right? Man, if they're eating really big yellow perch, really big bluegill around the spawn, a 4 or a 5-inch Grub, perfect imitation. But if you get out there and you're in the post-spawn and there's fry in the water everywhere. And remember, post-spawn, which in a lot of places is April, May, June, right? Everything has spawned. Crappie, perch, the bass spawned, the carp spawned. Dude, you look in the water on post-spawn. All your bait is little, 2, 3 inches long. If your 4-inch is little, go to those smaller size Grubs. Don't sleep on the 2 and 3-inch Berkley Power Grub if that's the size of your forage, okay? So size-wise, 2 to 5 inches, the 3 and 5-inch Grub get a bulk of the work for me. I love those sizes. And then color, honestly, guys, if you look at the colors that I carry, they're very, very simple. Very simple. I like the whites and the pearls. Love that to imitate your bait fish, right? A shad, herring, alewife, shiners, anything with a silvery shine to it. I like those pearls and those whites. I like something bright. I like a chartreuse color or something with a chartreuse tail for when your forage species are bright. Bluegill, yellow perch, anything that has those brighter colors to it, great imitation. And then last but not least, I carry these neutral colors. And my neutral colors are colors like straight up pumpkin seed, has a little brownish to it, right? Watermelon, that greenish brown look into that translucent watermelon. But the same thing applies. I'm trying to match the color to the forage. Pumpkin seed, if there's crawfish in the water, gobies, that faded down watermelon's a great color, right? So think about color. Don't go crazy. And of course, guys, I'm forever carrying a Sharpie marker with me, a Spike It pen, where I can modify on the fly if I need to change that color. If I need to add a little orange or a black dot, I could do it on the fly. All right, so 2 to 5 inch, natural colors, right? Colors to match the hatch. Don't go crazy with colors. And now let's talk about the rigging for that Grub. And, let me tell you this. 90% of the time that I'm fishing a Grub, I'm rigging it on a ball head. A regular, straight up ball head. 90% of the time. The other 10%, I have Texas rigged the Grub before, and you could do that. And I have for sure fished a Grub on the back of a swim jig as a trailer. But 90% of the time, I'm fishing this Grub. I'm fishing it on a good old-fashioned ball head. All right? A lot of companies making jig heads out there. Pick one. Here's the only rule. You ready? Pick one that has a 90-degree line tie on it. I don't care if it's an Eagle Claw, whatever your brand is. Pick a jig head for your grub that has a 90-degree line tie. I've got these jig heads in non-weedless versions, and I carry these ball heads in versions that have little wire guards on them. And depending on the cover, I put the open hook jig or the wire guard, fiber guard jig head if there's cover, right? So regular ball head. On sizes of your jig head for that grub, here's the best rule. Fish the weight of the jig head that's heavy enough to keep you in control with that lure, right? So, you know, if it's flat, dead calm and you're fishing shallow water, man, you can get away with a lighter jig head. If the wind's blowing and you're fishing deeper, you need to get to a heavier jig head, okay? But in general, I carry from a 16th ounce, little 16th ounce jig heads, especially for my smaller grubs, all the way up to a 3/8 ounce jig head for my bigger grubs in my deeper water. But if I had to pick a size that I fish the most, it's a 1/4 ounce or a 3/16. And I really believe those two sizes, especially the 1/4 ounce, gives you a lot of control of that bait. So I can fish it high, I can fish it medium, I can fish it low. Could do a lot of stuff with that 1/4 ounce ball head. All right, let's get to the rigging. And rigging a grub on that ball head is the easiest thing you could do with one thing you got to remember. And that's you always want the tail of that grub facing the opposite way of the bend of the hook, okay? So if I'm holding this jig head and the bend of my hook is going up, when I put that grub on that jig, I want the bend of my tail going down. When you counter those directions, hook up, tail down, when you rig it, when you thread it, it's going to give that grub maximum action. And remember, the beauty of this lure, stay in the dirty water. Prefrontal, windy, cloudy, fish that are biting, warming water, right? The beauty of that tail is all that big action. And if you rig it the same way as that hook goes up, you're still going to have action, but it's not going to be as big and it's not going to be as fluid as rigging it correctly, okay? So all we're going to do is thread it. So once I know I want it the opposite way of the hook, I put it in the middle of that grub. By the way, this is the 4-inch Berkley Power Grub. And I just go around till I get that grub body about halfway on the shank of that hook. Once it's halfway, boom, I pop it out of the body and I continue threading it. Listen to me. As long as that grub body's straight and that bend of the tail, look, opposite way of the bend of the hook, as long as that's happening, you're going to have maximum action of that bait. One other thing about that 90-degree angle, I told you that was key on the jig head. It's going to keep this bait running horizontal. You never want it running through the water head down or head up because it impedes the action of that tail. All right, let's get to the 3 main ways that I'm going to fish this bait. And I'm going to do this quick because these are pretty self-explanatory. But once I get that grub and I'm going to rig it on this head, once again, opposite way of the bend of the hook, halfway down the body, push it out, make sure it's straight, there it goes. I'm really going to use retrieve techniques that activate that tail, okay? The first one is just what I call a steady retrieve. And the steady retrieve, I'm going to make a long cast out there past the fish, and I'm just going to reel that thing back in. And I'm going to let the motion of that water resisting against that tail activate it. The great thing about the steady retrieve is with a faster retrieve and my rod high, I can keep the grub high in the water column. Schooling fish, fish that are feeding up, fish that are above submergent vegetation, Perfect technique. If I use that same steady retrieve, and all I have to do now is, once I get this tangle out, all I have to do now is lower my rod tip. When I do that same retrieve and lower my rod tip, that grub is going to get into the middle of the water column. And steady retrieve, water resistance activates that tail. Now it's perfect for suspended fish. The side of docks, suspended in timber, down a bluff bank, on a riprap bank, suspended fish. Perfect action. So steady retrieve, the #1 way I'm going to retrieve it. #2, you know this from other bait selections, is the slow roll. On this one, I'm letting that grub get to the bottom. Boom. Once it hits the bottom, I'm using that same steady retrieve, but ultra slow. Ultra slow, just really slow rolling that along the bottom. And about every 20 cranks, as I'm slow rolling that grub, every 20 cranks, I stop, I let it contact the bottom, and then I begin that retrieve again. And when those fish are relating to the bottom, if they're feeding on crawfish, perfect imitation. If they're feeding on little eels, perfect imitation. Anytime they're near the bottom, slow rolling gets the nod. All right, last but not least, guys, and this is one that you know of from fishing a jig. It's the same basic technique, and it's called stroking or snapping a grub. You see a lot of guys use this retrieve also with a tube jig. Is the same technique. And on this one, we're going to make a cast to where those fish are at, the cover structure they're relating to. We're going to let it get to the bottom. Once that bait hits the bottom, instead of that steady retrieve with a rod up, steady retrieve with a rod in the middle, or instead of the slow roll, now we're going to let that bait hit the bottom. And when it hits the bottom, we're going to snap our rod tip from 3 to 12. Snap! And then when we snap it up, we're going to follow it back down to the bottom. Boom. Hits the bottom. 3 to 12. Snap. Follow it back down to the bottom. And this snapping or stroking technique is going to let that grub hit the bottom, rapidly jump up, and then when it falls back down on that controlled slack, that tail is just going crazy. And remember, the tail is the key to the grub. Okay, so 3 ways to fish it. And then last but not least is the rod and reel. Guys, here's a real easy way to describe it. Whatever rod and reel you're using right now for your finesse swim baits, your 2H or 3-3s, we're going to use the same exact rod. Keep it real simple. In general, guys, we want a 7 to 7.4 medium action spinning rod. That's what I'm fishing it on, okay? 7 to 7.4 medium action spinning rod. We're going to use a 20 or 30 size spinning reel. And my #1 way to fish that grub in all conditions is light braid to a light fluorocarbon leader. I like 10 or 15 pound braid to a 6 to 12 pound fluorocarbon leader. My favorite combo for sure is Berkley X5 10 pound braid to 8 pound Berkley Trilene 100% fluorocarbon leader. Gives me a lot of control of that grub, gives me a lot of sensitivity on long cast, and that's really the deal, okay? Guys, once again, listen, this lure category, don't sleep on a grub. For conditions when you want something a little different, when you want something for more stained water, everybody's throwing that little boot tail swim bait. When you wanted something a little different with more action, try an old school grub. I guarantee you're going to catch some fish. I hope you enjoyed this shop. We're talking about grubs. Man, if you like what you're seeing, if you like what you're hearing, subscribe to my channel. Hit that button. If you're already a subscriber, tell your friends about Mike Iaconelli Fishing on YouTube. If they subscribe, they're going to get a notification. We have a new piece of content dropping every single week. Give that grub a try, and you're going to catch more fish. Bye. Hey everybody, Mike Iaconelli. I hope you enjoyed this week's In the Shop. I hope you learned a little bit. And if you like these videos, remember, there's a whole boatload. Check out these two, and you're going to learn more about bass fishing.